The report reached the conclave 103 standard hours later. It arrived flagged as urgent, encoded in a burst transmission so compressed it bordered on distortion. By the time it was decoded, cross-referenced, and routed through the labyrinthine channels of interspecies bureaucracy, it had already begun to rot under the weight of its own implications. The Vorathi pilot's testimony was attached in full unedited. That, more than anything, unsettled the analysts who first reviewed it. The Vorathi were not prone to embellishment. They were creatures of strict observation, their language evolved to minimize ambiguity, their culture built on precise reporting. And yet the transcript read like something else. The station was not responding. No signals, no emissions, no defensive posture. It was as if it expected me. I conducted a passive scan, internal atmosphere confirmed, biological signatures consistent with the human species. They were waiting. They turned to look at me. All of them simultaneously. That line alone triggered 3 independent requests for neurological evaluation of the pilot. The requests were denied. Because the sensor data corroborated everything. The station existed, it was vast, it was powered, it was occupied. And it had not been there 3 cycles prior. The conclave convened. For most species, a conclave assembly was a rare and ceremonious event. Entire solar systems would pause their internal disputes, trade routes would be rerouted, and the endless machinery of interstellar civilization would momentarily hold its breath. For humanity, had they been invited, it would have been called a meeting. The chamber itself was an architectural compromise, a necessity when dealing with entities whose forms range from liquid intelligences suspended in electromagnetic fields to towering structures of mineral and light. Gravity was optional. Atmosphere varied by zone. Translation fields hummed quietly, stitching meaning across incompatible modes of perception. Ambassador Thais Kalur was present. They had not expected to be. Their report, filed nearly a century prior, had been categorized, archived, and forgotten. To be summoned now quietly, without explanation, suggested that someone somewhere had finally read the footnote. Anomalous readings suggest secondary construction projects of undetermined purpose. No cause for concern. Thais Kalur did not chuckle. Vorathi did not chuckle. But if they had, this would have been the moment. The primitives have constructed a deep space installation of significant scale, announced the presiding speaker, a being whose voice manifested simultaneously as sound, color, and mild gravitational distortion. They have done so without detection, without declaration, without compliance. A ripple passed through the chamber. Concern, irritation, disbelief, each species expressed it differently, but the meaning translated cleanly. This violates observation parameters, said one delegate. It demonstrates technological advancement beyond Tier 4 classification, said another. It demonstrates concealment, said a third more quietly. That word lingered. Concealment. Not growth, not progress, not evolution. Concealment implied intent. Thais Kalur extended a limb into the speaking field. The report I filed in year 212 noted anomalous construction signatures, they said. The recommendation for continued passive observation was based on incomplete data. The speaker pulsed. You indicated no cause for concern. I indicated insufficient evidence of threat, Thais Kalur replied. Those are not equivalent. The chamber shifted. Subtle but measurable. Clarify, said the speaker. Thais Kalur accessed the archived data, projecting it into the shared field. Long-forgotten sensor readings bloomed into visibility, faint energy signatures, irregular mass distributions, patterns that had been dismissed as noise. Humanity ceased broadcasting at consistent intervals approximately 180 cycles ago, Thais Kalur said. Their early behavior was typical: exploratory transmissions, attempts at contact, inefficient propulsion experiments. Then the pattern changed. The projections sharpened. Their broadcasts became sporadic, then rare, then almost entirely absent. They lost interest, said a crystalline delegate. They became inward-focused, said another. They failed, suggested a third. Thais Kalur dimmed the projections slightly. No, they said, they became quiet. Quiet in galactic terms was unusual. Young species were loud. They announced themselves with reckless enthusiasm, broadcasting their existence across the void, building monuments visible from neighboring systems, sending probes in every direction with no regard for detection. It was a phase it always passed. Eventually, species learned. The universe was not empty, and it was not safe. Those who survived long enough to understand that truth adapted. They lowered their emissions, they masked their signatures, they became careful. But humanity had not followed that pattern. They had gone from loud to silent too quickly. And now it seemed they had not simply gone silent. They had gone still. Let's dispatch a probe, the speaker ordered. Passive or active, asked a delegate. The chamber hesitated. This too was unusual. Protocol dictated passive observation. It had always dictated passive observation. To interfere with a pre-FTL species was to risk contamination, escalation, unpredictable consequences. But humanity was no longer behaving like a pre-FTL species. They have constructed a station beyond their planetary orbit, said the speaker. They have demonstrated capabilities inconsistent with classification. Passive observation has failed. A pause. Then, active probe authorized. The probe was small. It had to be. Anything larger risk detection and detection, if the Voraci pilot's report was to be believed, was no longer hypothetical. It slipped into the human system along a trajectory calculated to mimic natural debris. Its emissions were minimal, its presence masked by layers of signal dampening that had fooled civilizations far more advanced than humanity was supposed to be. It should have been invisible. It was not. The station did not power up. It did not deploy defenses. It did not broadcast a warning. It simply noticed. The probe sensors registered a shift, not in the station itself but in the surrounding space. Subtle distortions, fluctuations that did not correspond to any known propulsion or energy system. The probe attempted to adjust its course. It could not. Something had it. Not physically, not in any way the probe could measure. But its trajectory was no longer its own. It drifted gently, inevitably, toward the station. Inside the conclave chamber, silence spread. Data streamed in real time, projected into the shared field. Every delegate watched as the probe's state-of-the-art, shielded, concealed, was guided effortlessly into proximity with the human structure. No emission, murmured one analyst. No tractor field, said another. No identifiable mechanism, added a third. Thais Kalor said nothing. They were watching the station. The airlock opened. That at least was familiar. Mechanical, predictable. The probe transmitted visual data as it passed through the threshold, its sensors adjusting to the artificial environment within. Corridors, gravity, atmosphere, human design unmistakable in its inefficiencies and redundancies. And then, movement. A figure stepped into view. Humans, unarmored, unaugmented, at least superficially. They approached the probe with an ease that suggested neither surprise nor urgency. The probe activated its communication suite. Unidentified installation, it transmitted. This is a conclave exploratory unit. Identify your. The human raised a hand. The transmission stopped. Not jammed. Not disrupted. Stopped. The probe systems were still functioning. Its communication array was intact, but the signal simply ceased to exist beyond a certain point. As if the universe itself had declined to carry it any further. The human tilted their head. Too early, they said. Their voice was clear. Unfiltered. It should not have been. The probe had not activated its audio receivers. And yet, too early, the human repeated almost gently. They reached out, touched the probe, and everything went dark. The conclave lost contact. Not gradually, not with interference or degradation. One moment data streamed. The next, nothing. Complete absence. The probe had not been destroyed. It had not transmitted a failure signal. It had simply vanished. Every system that should have registered its loss returned null results. As if the probe had never existed. The chamber erupted. Not in sound, many species had no concept of sound, but in activity, in overlapping signals, in the chaotic exchange of information and alarm. This is a breach. This is interference. This is. This is intentional, Thaiscalor said. The chamber stilled. Not completely, but enough. They are not unaware of us, Thaiscalor continued. They are not primitive, they are not passive. The speaker focused. Then what are they? Thaiscalor considered. For a moment they accessed the pilot's testimony again, the line that had seemed at the time almost absurd. They were waitings. They are prepared, Thaiscalor said. 300 years of silence. 300 years of watching, of measuring, of building in the spaces no one had thought to look. Humanity had not been reaching out. They had been listening. And in the vast, cold quiet of the galaxy, they had heard something that the Conclave had long since learned to ignore. Patterns. Absences. The subtle signatures of things that did not wish to be found. The Conclave believed itself to be the highest authority, the collective wisdom of countless civilizations. But it was not alone. It had never been alone. And humanity had noticed. The second report arrived without warning. No transmission. No probe. No detectable origins. It simply appeared. Embedded in the Conclave's central data network, bypassing security layers that had been considered impenetrable. The message was short, concise. Humans, we are not ready to join you. You are not ready to meet what follows us. Remain quiet. We will call when it is safe. For the first time in its recorded history, the Galactic Conclave did something it had never done before. It listened, and slowly, uncertainly, it began to fall silent. The emergency channel did not merely erupt. It fractured. Across 47 capital ships and the scattered remnants of 300 escorts, hundreds of species attempted to speak at once, each through its own medium, each with its own urgency. Sound collided with light. Mathematical proofs overlaid pheromone bursts. Gravity pulses stuttered against electromagnetic screams. For a full 6 seconds, nothing intelligible existed. Then the Conclave's command protocols, ancient, rigid, designed for moments exactly like this, forced order into chaos. Priority signals locked. Translation fields stabilized. Hierarchy reasserted itself. And at the center of every display, every interface, every sensory projection, Fleet Admiral Marin Solis of Earth Command waited. She did not hurry them. That, more than anything, unsettled the Conclave. Young species hurried. They filled silence with noise, rushed to justify themselves, demanded recognition. This human did none of those things. She simply waited. Patient. Certain. As if she had all the time in the universe. Human command, the Conclave speaker began, their voice carefully modulated into a form the translation fields could render as neutral. You have engaged Conclave vessels without provocation. You have interfered with lawful observation. You have entered restricted space, Marin Solis said, cutting in not loudly, not aggressively, but with a precision that sliced cleanly through the speaker's authority. With a war fleet. There was no emotion in her tone. Just fact. The speaker paused. That too was unprecedented. No such restriction was declared, the speaker replied. Of course it wasn't, Marin said. You don't believe in declarations, not for species at our classification level. A ripple passed through the channel. She knows. Not suspects. Knows. We are aware of your protocols, Marin continued. Tier classification, observation guidelines, intervention thresholds, we've read your archives. That was impossible. The Conclave's archives were not merely secure. They were distributed, fragmented across multiple dimensions of storage, encoded in formats that required species-specific cognition to interpret. No emerging civilization should have been able to access them. No civilization period had ever accessed them without authorization. You are making claims without evidence, the speaker said. Marin tilted her head slightly. Then behind her something changed. The background of her transmission, previously a neutral command deck, shifted. Data bloomed into existence, layered in a way that the Conclave's translation system struggled to interpret. Not images. Not exactly. Records. Conclave records. Fragments of internal deliberations. strategic outlines, contingency frameworks. 17 of them, each labeled, each annotated, each understood. We're not making claims, Marin said softly. We're quoting you. Shock in the conclave was not a simple emotion. It was a cascade. For some species, it manifested as sudden thermal spikes. For others, structural instability. For still others, a complete cessation of activity as processing resources reallocated to reconcile the impossible. Across the fleet, that cascade rippled. Because this was not merely a breach. It was exposure. Every hidden assumption, every quiet calculation, every carefully constructed plan for dealing with a species they had never intended to speak to. All of it seen. All of it understood. You will cease this transmission immediately, the speaker said. No, Marin replied. Still calm. Still patient. You will withdraw your forces from human-controlled space. You will terminate all hostile operations. You will. No, Marin said again. This time there was something else in her voice. Not anger. Not even irritation. Just a weariness. You don't understand the situation you're in, she said, and we don't have time to educate you the slow way. The speaker's form pulsed sharply. You are in no position to issue demands. Marin smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. No, she said, you are. The display shifted again. Not to conclave data. To something else. Sensor feeds. Raw, unfiltered, pulled directly from the conclave fleet's own systems. At first, nothing seemed different. Stars, debris, the quiet expanse of interstellar space. Then the overlays appeared. And the conclave saw what their sensors had been ignoring. The stations. Not 2, not 3, hundreds. Scattered throughout the system, hidden in asteroid belts, embedded in planetary rings, drifting in the vast dark between worlds. Each one silent. Each one active. Each one watching. How long? Whispered a delegate, the translation rendering their emission as sound by approximation. About 150 years, Marin said. For the first generation, we've iterated since then. The speaker's field distorted. This scale of construction is impossible to conceal. It wasn't concealed, Marin said, not exactly. She gestured and the overlays shifted again. This time the conclave saw their own sensor logs. Centuries of data. Filtered, categorized, dismissed. Noise. Anomalies. Statistical outliers. We didn't hide from your sensors, Marin said. We hid inside your assumptions. Silence. Real silence this time. Because there was no immediate response to that. No protocols. No prepared statement. Only the slow, dawning realization that the conclave had not been observing humanity. It had been missing them. You engaged our fleet, the speaker said at last, clinging to the structure of the argument like a lifeline. You destroyed conclave vessels. That is an act of war. Marin nodded. Yes, she said, it is. No denials. No justification. Just acknowledgement. And you will answer for that, the speaker continued. Marin leaned forward slightly. Listen carefully, she said, because I'm only going to explain this once. The background behind her shifted again. This time the data was different. Not conclave records. Not sensor logs. Something older. Deeper. Patterns. At first glance, they seemed random, irregular distortions, gaps in stellar distribution, regions where expected signals simply weren't. Then the scale expanded. And the pattern emerged. Absences. Vast, deliberate absences. Entire regions of space where nothing remained. No stars. No debris. No radiations. Just nothing. These aren't natural, Marin said. The conclave did not respond. They were too busy recalculating. Because they recognized those regions. They had cataloged them. Classified them. Avoided them. Not out of fear. Out of practicality. There was nothing there. Nothing worth studying. Nothing worth approaching. Dead zones. We call them quiet zones, Marin said. You call them whatever your translation systems render for not useful. A flicker of something amusement perhaps crossed her face. We've been studying them for 200 years, she continued. We didn't start building in the dark because of you, you were just a useful test case. The speaker's form tightened. Explain, they said. Marin took a breath. And for the first time since the transmission began, she looked, not uncertain but aware of the weight of what she was about to say. We didn't go quiet to avoid being noticed, she said. We went quiet because something else notices noise. What? The conclave had no concept for that. Not really. They understood danger, they understood predators, they understood the slow, grinding conflicts between civilizations. But this, something that noticed noise. At a galactic scale, it was primitive, superstitious, the kind of idea young species invented before they understood the universe. You expect us to believe, the speaker began. No, Marin said. I expect you to remember. The data shifted again. Historical records. Not humans. Conclave. Ancient. Older than many of the species currently present. Records of civilizations that had once been part of the conclave. Names that no longer appeared in any current registry. Systems that were now quiet zones. You've seen this before, Marin said softly, you just didn't connect it. The speaker did not respond. Because they were searching. Digging through archives that had not been accessed in millennia. Finding the patterns. The timelines. The abrupt, inexplicable disappearances. Civilizations that had reached a certain threshold. And then were gone. No distress signals. No evidence of war. No remnants. Just absence. It doesn't come for everyone, Marin said, not immediately, not predictably, but there's a correlation. She brought up a final set of data. Broadcast strength. Energy outputs. Expansion rate. All the species that vanished, she said, they were loud, expanding, broadcasting, announcing themselves. She met the speaker's gaze. You taught us to do that, she said. In your archives, in your examples, that's what successful civilizations do, right? No one answered. Yeah, Marin said, that's what we thought too. She leaned back. And then we noticed what happened to them. The silence stretched. Heavy, dense, because the implication was no longer abstract. It was immediate. The conclave was old. Vast, loud. So we stopped, Marin said. We shut down everything we could, we buried our infrastructure, we masked our signals. We learned how to exist without being interesting. She gestured at the destroyed ships, still drifting in the void. And when you showed up with a fleet broadcasting at full military output, she added, you made us very nervous. You are proposing, the speaker began slowly, carefully, that there exists an external threat that selectively targets technologically advanced civilizations based on detectability. Yes, Marin said. And you have evidence of this. Marin paused. Then she nodded. Indirect, she said, pattern-based, incomplete. She held the speaker's gaze. But consistent. And your solution, the speaker said, is silence. Marin exhaled. Not just silence, she said, control, discipline, awareness. She gestured again, and the image shifted back to the fleet. To the wreckage. To the surviving ships. You came in loud, she said, bright, obvious. You lit up the system like a signal flare. Her voice hardened just slightly. We couldn't let that continue. You destroyed 11 capital ships, the speaker said. Yes, Marin replied. You crippled our fleet. Oh yes. You interfered with our communications. Oh yes. A pause. And you expect us to negotiate. Marin smiled again. This time it was almost gentle. Yes, she said, because if we're right, you don't have a fleet anymore. The words hung in the void. Because they were not a threat. They were a warnings. Behind the conclave fleet, in the vast, silent dark between stars, something shifted. Not visibly. Not in any way the sensors could immediately detect. But the background radiation, normally a steady, predictable hum, dipped. Just slightly. just for a moment, then returned. Marin saw it. Of course she did. Her eyes flicked just for an instant to a display the conclave could not see. Then back. Her expression did not change. But something in her posture did. Urgency. Not panic. Never panic. But urgency. We don't have much time, she said quietly. For the first time since the transmission began, the conclave speaker did not argue. Did not assert. Did not deny. They simply asked, "What do you propose?" Marin Solis leaned forward. And for the first time, she did not look like someone negotiating. She looked like someone giving instructions. "We make you quiet," she said. "Or we all find out what happens when we're not." The station had no name. At least none that the conclave delegation could access. It existed in their navigation systems as a set of coordinates and a designation assigned by Human Traffic Control, Anchor 12, but even that felt less like a name and more like a placeholder, something intentionally unremarkable. A label that told you nothing about what it was, who built it, or why it existed. Which High Arbiter Yeson was beginning to understand was entirely the point. The shuttle's docking clamps engaged with a precision that bordered on insult. No drift, no correction thrusters firing at the last moment, no human pilot making adjustments. The station had simply taken them, guiding the vessel into place with such seamless control that the conclave's own instruments struggled to identify when the maneuver had begun. Yeson felt it. Not physically, his species did not experience motion in the way humans did, but cognitively. A subtle mismatch between expectation and reality. They had not docked. They had been placed. Atmospheric compatibility confirmed, announced the shuttle systems. Of course it is, one of the delegation murmured. Because the alternative would have been inconvenient. And humanity, it seemed, did not tolerate inconvenience in matters that mattered. The airlock cycled. The doors opened. And the conclave stepped into a space they could not map. It was not that the station's architecture was incomprehensible. On the contrary, it was almost aggressively mundane. Smooth surfaces, clean lines, materials that conformed to gravity in predictable ways, corridors that extended in straight, logical paths. Humans. Recognizable. But wrong. Yeson extended a sensory filament, brushing against the walls not physically, but through the suite of instruments embedded within his diplomatic casing. The readings came back consistent. Density, composition, structural integrity. Everything normals. And yet, your scans are incomplete, Director Esperanza Calloway said. Yeson withdrew the filament instantly. He had not spoken. Had not signaled. Had not. Don't be alarmed, Calloway added, her tone calm, almost reassuring. We designed it that way. She gestured down the corridor. Plays this way. They walked, or drifted, or flowed depending on the species. The conclave delegation was a carefully assembled representation of its member civilizations, each adapted to the station's environment through personal fields and translation matrices. A procession of forms that anywhere else would have commanded attention. Here they felt as small. Not physically, conceptually, because every step they took was through a space whose rules they did not understand. Your station is unusually opaque, Yeson said, once they had progressed far enough that silence became conspicuous. Calloway glanced back at him. Is it? She said lightly. We find it quite transparent. Yeson did not respond immediately. Because the statement was not dismissive. It was accurate. For her. For humans. This was a space they understood completely. Every surface, every system, every hidden layer. And for the conclaves, it was a surface. Only a surface. You have no external markings, another delegate observed. No cultural identifiers, no symbolic structures. Most species use first contact environments to communicate identity. Calloway smiled faintly. We're not interested in being interpreted, she said. We're interested in being understood. That is the same thing, the delegate replied. Calloway stopped walking. Turned. No, she said. And for a moment, just a moment, there was something in her eyes that the translation field struggled with. something too complex, too layered to render cleanly. It really is. The negotiation chamber was simple. Intentionally so. A circular room, a central table, environmental controls that adjusted seamlessly to each delegate's needs. No elevated platforms, no hierarchical positioning. Equality expressed architecturally. Yeson would have appreciated the symbolism. If he believed it. Please, Calloway said, gesturing to the table, sit, or whatever the appropriate equivalent is. They did. Not because they trusted her, but because at this point, refusal would have been performative. And the Conclave had already learned that performance did not impress humanity. You must understand, Yeson began, once the chamber had sealed and the system's confirmed isolation, that the Conclave acted on the basis of what your silence implied. Calloway nodded. Of course you did, she said, that's how you operate. Yeson ignored the implication. You offered no diplomatic overtures, no requests for inclusion in galactic trade networks, no territorial declarations, you simply built, Calloway said. There it was again. That word. Simple, unadorned, and somehow heavier than any accusation. Yes, Yeson said. Yes, we did, Calloway replied. She folded her hands on the table. And for the first time since they had met her, she did not smile. Because we'd heard your broadcasts. Yeson's internal processes stuttered. Your official transmissions are informative, Calloway continued. Protocols, trade standards, cultural exchanges, very polished. She tilted her head slightly. We weren't listening to those. The room changed. Not physically, but perceptually. Because now, every delegate understood exactly where this was going. Your internal communications, Calloway said, the debates in your high chamber, the classification systems, the strategic assessments. She spoke the words without emphasis, without accusation, which made them land harder. The discussions about Tier 4 primitives, she went on, about which emerging species were worth cultivating, which ones would become useful partners, which ones were statistically likely to collapse and therefore not worth the investment. She looked at Yeson. Directly. The way you divided the galaxy, she said, as if it already belonged to you. Silence. Not the deliberate, controlled silence humanity had cultivated. Not the tense, anticipatory silence of negotiation. This was something else. This was the silence of being seen. Of having something internal, private, assumed to be inaccessible laid out plainly. You monitored our encrypted communications, Yeson said at last. It was not a question. Calloway nodded. For about 200 years, yes. 200 years. Yeson processed that. Reprocessed it. Failed to reconcile it with anything resembling normalcy. Your encryption hadn't changed significantly, Calloway added. We kept expecting it to, it would have been more interesting. There it was again. That word. Interesting. As if the Conclave's most secure systems had been a puzzle. A problem. Something to pass the time. We do not want war, Calloway said. The statement was so direct, so unembellished, that it cut cleanly through the tension. We never did, she continued. We want a seat at the table that isn't offered out of pity or strategic calculation. She leaned forward slightly. We want to be peers. There was no demand in her voice. No threat. Just expectation. As if this were not a negotiation. As if it were a conclusion. She slid a document across the table. Physical. Deliberate. Yeson looked at it. Then at her. Then slowly he reached out and took it. The material was unfamiliar. Not in composition, his instruments could identify it easily enough, but in intent. Humans did not need physical documents. They had demonstrated that much. This was a choice. A gesture. Something symbolic. He began to read. The terms were, as she had said, reasonable. Which made them devastating. Full membership in the conclaves. Not provisional. Not conditional. Full. A permanent seat on the Security Council. Veto authority. Access to all shared knowledge repositories. mutual non-interference agreements, revisions to tier classification protocols, encryption standard overhauls, monitoring restrictions, and beneath it all woven into every clause, every provision. An assumption, equality, not requested, not negotiated, assumed. You could have contacted us at any time, Yeson said, looking up from the document. You had the capability long before you. Yes, Calloway said. She did not let him finish. Yes, we did. No denials. No deflection. Then why, Yeson asked, why remain silent, why build in secret, why wait? Calloway tapped the document lightly. Because you wouldn't have listened, she said. There was no arrogance in the statement. No triumph. Just certainty. You would have categorized us, she continued, assigned us a classification, determined our value based on incomplete data, offered us a place that fit your existing structures. She met his gaze, and we would have had to accept it. Yeson said nothing. Because he could not. Because every word she spoke aligned perfectly with conclave precedent. With history. With how they had always done things. We're a species that spent most of our history negotiating from weakness, Calloway said. Her voice softened slightly. Not with vulnerabilities. With memories. We learned what that does to you, she went on. How it shapes your decisions, your priorities, your sense of what's possible. She leaned back. We decided not to do that again. The statement hung in the air. Heavy. Final. Because it was not just an explanation. It was a declaration. Humanity had not remained silent out of fear. Not out of caution. Out of choice. Now, Calloway said, we're having this conversation as equals. She tapped the document again. And now, she added, you will listen. Yeson looked down at the terms. Then at the table. Then at the walls of the station. And for the first time since boarding, he allowed himself to truly consider where he was. Not just physically, but strategically. They were in a human-controlled environment. Surrounded by systems they did not understand. Dependent on infrastructure they could not access. Negotiating with a species that had anticipated this moment for centuries. This was not a meeting. It was an outcome. You have engineered this situation, he said slowly. Calloway considered that. Then she nodded. Yes, she said. We have. No apologies. No justification. Just truth. You leave us little room for refusal, Yeson said. Calloway's expression did not change. There is always a choice, she said. Yeson almost laughed. Almost. And if we choose to reject these terms, he asked. Calloway was quiet for a moment. Not long. Just enough. Then you go back to being loud, she said. And we go back to protecting ourselves. The implication was clear. They had seen what that looked like. 40 minutes. 11 capital ships. A fleet reduced to debris and silence. And the external threat, Yeson asked. The one you claim necessitates this behavior. Calloway's gaze did not waver. We're not claiming, she said. We're surviving. 3 months later, the vote was held. It was not unanimous. It could not be. There were species within the conclave that could not accept what had happened. That could not reconcile the idea of a Tier 4 primitive ascending not through gradual integration, but through inevitability. Through preparation. Through patience. But they were a minorities. And they were increasingly quiet. Humanity entered the Galactic Conclave not as an emerging civilization granted provisional membership. Not as a junior partner assigned a ceremonial seat. But as something that had no precedent. A founding equivalent member. With veto rights. With a permanent chair on the Security Council. With influence that had not been granted. But recognized. The changes began immediately. Broadcast protocols were revised. Transmission thresholds lowered. Encryption standards rebuilt from the ground up. Observation policies rewritten, not abandoned but reconsidered. Because the galaxy, it seemed, was not as empty as it had once appeared. And slowly, reluctantly, the conclave began to change. It became quieter. Not silent, never entirely, but quieter, more deliberate, more aware. 500 years later, in a lecture hall orbiting a star that humanity had never bothered to name, a conclave historian addressed a room full of students. They came from dozens of species. Some old, some new, all inheritors of a galaxy that had learned at great cost the value of restraint. The first contact period, the historian said, is often mischaracterized as a diplomatic turning point. She paused. It was not. She brought up an image. A human station. Unmarked. Unremarkable. Impenetrable. It was a correction, she said. A realization. The students leaned forward, listening, because that, more than anything, was what the conclave now valued. Listening. Humanity did not arrive loudly, the historian continued. They did not announce themselves, they did not demand recognition. She smiled slightly. They did something far more effective. The image shifted. To darkness. To the spaces between stars. To the vast, quiet regions that had once been ignored. They listened, she said. They watched. They learned. And then, finally, the historian displayed the line that every student in that room would memorize. The line that had been written centuries ago, at the end of a long, careful account of how a young species had outgrown the assumptions of an ancient one. They were not quiet because they were afraid. They were quiet because they were listening and they were patient. And when they finally chose to speak, they had already won.